Investment solutions with confidence.
Europe has reached a critical tipping point. It faces either disintegration and collapse or a chance to achieve deeper integration and emerge much stronger from the current crisis. Of what concern is Europe's future to the African continent? Well, quite simply, whatever happens in Europe reverberates in the markets of the rest of the world. Everyone felt the fear and uncertainty sparked by the banking crisis in Cyprus in March of this year, and the political upheaval in Italy just weeks before. A year and a half ago, it was Greece that dominated the world headlines. Germany, still the powerhouse of the Eurozone, is being caricatured as a disciplinarian big brother by some, while other extremists even equate Angela Merkel to Hitler. The division between Northern and Southern Europe is the topic of many a discourse. The Eurozone is reeling. There was a time after the global financial crisis of 2008 that hopes were high for a speedy recovery, but the recession is dragging on for Europe with little hope for a solution, at least not soon. But does this mean the 17 Eurozone countries and 27 European Union member states are moving toward an inevitable train smash? This kind of all-encompassing crisis, with its financial, economic, political, societal and moral ramifications, was surely not what world leaders had in mind when they drew up the post-World War II project for an integrated Europe. But it was not a common currency that was the driving force for unification. It was the memory of war and the devastation it left behind, and a desire to guarantee Europeans a life of peace, safety and freedom. This crisis is, of course, something that the founding fathers could never have dreamed of. So why did it happen, and can it be stopped? That's what we intend to find out. And let's start in Spain, and specifically in the beautiful city of Barcelona.
It's affecting so much because normally the inside business in Spain is in a very low level, and because I am working in factory automation, and just companies who are exporting are surviving a little bit, but internal consumption and internal investments are in a very low situation.
No creemos que tengamos un trabajo en un futuro. Vamos a tener que irnos fuera de España, sí o sí. Yo conozco un amigo que sacó la carrera de arquitectura y se ha tenido que ir a Brasil a trabajar porque aquí no tenía nada. Y yo tengo una amiga que ha acabado la carrera de periodismo y se ha tenido que ir a Inglaterra a trabajar.
Y una parte sí es culpa del Estado. Hay mucha corrupción, hay falta de políticas sociales, muchas cosas, sí.
Do you think that the policy of austerity, in other words, no spending and cutting back, is the right policy or the wrong policy for Spain?
No, yo creo que no es una buena política. Los recortes no son una buena política porque siempre se oprime a los mismos, a los que no tienen.
Now the difference is a big difference. The people with money is same with money, yeah. And the people who don't work is without money.
Let's step back in time to take a brief look at the history of integration in Europe after the so-called war to end all wars. I was born in the swinging 60s. It was the first decade, of course, after the privations of the 1950s. And there was a genuine sort of sense of optimism everywhere. Youth culture was booming. We had the Beatles, and there was a general air of love and optimism everywhere around. At the same time, European Union countries stopped charging customs duties between each other, and there was a genuine belief that suddenly a united Europe might actually be able to work. The 60s was a time of expansion, new ideas and new possibilities. Then came the 1970s, and 3 new members of the European Union, the EU. It was Britain, it was Denmark, it was Ireland. Britain, of course, entered the EU kicking and screaming, but nonetheless, they did join, and suddenly there were 9 members. And quite importantly as well, at the same time, the last 2 European dictatorships fell in Portugal and most notably in Spain. General Franco was gone. From the introduction of floating rates in the early 1970s to the creation of the euro in 1999, Europe faced constant currency instability. Then came the 1980s, and at the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and the reunification of Germany was a reality. And surely we thought nothing could stop Europe now. We also got 3 new members, Greece, Spain and Portugal, and suddenly we were 12. Then came the 1990s and we had the Amsterdam and Maastricht treaties, and the 4 pillars of freedom were agreed upon. The free movement of goods, services, people and money. Borders were dismantled. You could travel anywhere without a passport, and young people did in their droves. And also we had 3 new members, Austria, Sweden and Finland. That was 1995. A single European currency was introduced. And in 2004, 10 countries entered the club. And in 2007, 2 more. Then we had the Lisbon Treaty. But then, after 2007, the dark clouds were already gathering. The financial crisis of 2008 hit the world and hit Europe really hard. The fallout from the 2008 financial crisis is still plaguing Europe, of course. So what we'll do is try to find out in the next hour where to next for this great region. We'll look at the examples of 2 different countries, 2 completely different countries in completely different situations. We'll look at the powerhouse of Europe, and that is Germany. And we'll look at Spain, which is a giant economy, but an economy that is teetering on the brink of collapse. It's got no growth, it's got high unemployment, and it's got huge, huge debts. George, you're of European ancestry, you've got Greek extraction, and when you see what's happening in Europe at the moment, do you agree with this grand scheme of idealism? Because it seems to be growing in momentum and becoming more and more complicated and less efficient.
We probably need to go back to how this whole thing started, because in theory, it actually looked semi-doable. It was always going to be a big ask, but when you had the Maastricht Treaty, in theory, if everyone stuck to the parameters set out in the Maastricht Treaty, what we lived through in 2008 and 2009 shouldn't have really happened. We should have been able to sail through that relatively easily. So what came out of that 2008-2009 recession was, of course, an exposure of everything that was wrong with Europe, and how, in fact, the whole Eurozone experiment, if you want to call it that, was perhaps a touch premature. So they learned very quickly that you needed a lot more unity than just a whole bunch of countries adopting the same currency and operating under one central bank. In fact, you needed, what you really needed was a fiscal union of sorts, and what you also needed was some sort of union on the banking side of things as well. So that's come out of it, and that's what they're effectively working on now.
I don't think Europe's problem at the core of it is the common currency. The common currency creates some rigidities which I think exposes problems sooner than later, and that's the advantage of Europe over the US, where you can actually hide the problems for a lot longer, but then of course they still come back at some stage. You've got to actually still deal with it. You can't spend more than what's coming in forever and ever. And in Europe, you've got the different fiscal policies. That isn't the problem. Right at the beginning, they came up with a Maastricht Treaty, and you say you should keep your debt to GDP below 60%. Your budget deficit should be below 3%. And that should be a point where the economy dips and you've got fiscal stimulus, etc., and your deficit should rise to 3%. Right, in a really bad times, and then fall and then go back, to balance sort of in better times. And your debt to GDP ratio likewise should actually, rise to a maximum of 60%. Now, none of these countries are meeting it. And in fact, Germany and France were the biggest culprits in the mid-2000s, where they went into an economic slump. They were the biggest gorillas in the zoo. And so they said, we're not going to actually meet these things, and you're going to have to give us latitude.
In our case study, Germany exemplifies the northern countries that adhered to fiscal discipline and maintained moderate levels of debt, and Spain for the southern countries where spending got out of hand.
Talk about gorillas in the zoo now, because Germany is the powerhouse of Europe, the economic powerhouse. You say the single currency isn't a problem, but how can a country like Germany and a country like Spain have the same currency when they are so different?
You could say that you could either describe the single currency as an anchor or a rigidity, depending on how you would what metaphor you'd like to apply to it. But in there, you need other flexibilities. The trouble is that in Europe, what's happened is because of various ideologies, etc., you've not only had the rigidities that the currency provides, but you've also got rigidities in other areas like labour law and that kind of thing. So you don't have other flexibilities to compensate for that thing, and so you get the imbalances growing until they break. And that's the point, is that in any system you need some flexibilities, and they haven't built in flexibilities. If anything, Brussels and the centralised bureaucracy is actually creating additional rigidities throughout the Eurozone, which is adding to the problems. Effectively, the whole system becomes quite a rigid structure, which is difficult then to manage, because everybody's holding onto their particular holy cows.
It's obviously a worldwide crisis, and I think the word crisis should be used, and the European Union is affected by that. Some countries in the European Union are heavily affected by that, others are less heavily affected by that. But it is a crisis and we are addressing it, and as always, Europe progresses by crisis. So the crisis is not just negative, but for those who have lost their jobs, who have lost their livelihoods, and who have at the moment a sharply reduced perspective on a bright future, of course, the crisis is hard and biting.
They're trying to catch a horse after it's bolted. That's what they're trying to do, essentially. And so, yeah, when you look at the way that they're dealing with the periphery, it's a little bit hodgepodge. We deal with Greece because they're in crisis, then we deal with Portugal, then we deal with Ireland, then we deal with Spain. Now they're dealing with Cyprus. Potentially they'll have to deal with Italy and maybe even France in the worst case scenario. So they're doing it bit by bit. They've put themselves in a position where they can deal with it to some degree. The ECB, of course, has helped them out a great deal. But there still isn't a sufficient amount of unity, fiscal unity and banking unity, for it to be a very comfortable position. When you have a look at all the political rhetoric that's happening in many of these countries, the latest being Italy, and all the austerity protests going on in most of the periphery, it's still quite difficult, I think, to get all of this passed.
I have to disagree very strongly with calling Southern Europe peripheral. It's very, very much part of the hardcore of the European Union. Italy is one of the founders of the European Union. Spain, Portugal, Greece are full members of the European Union, and I really feel that they are a full and integral part of the European Union. And I think European solidarity is at the heart of the Union. But it is true that the southern part of the Union has been earlier and more profoundly affected. And it is also true that the effects of the crisis are now also felt more strongly in the north.
After the break, we head north to look at the situation in Germany, and then south to Barcelona.